It's this part, the beginnings of the Dark Lord Sauron. Some of you might be interested to know that whenever Sauron first came to be, he was actually not evil. In fact, he was called Mairon. And that name of Mairon means the admirable. And it is from the Elvish language of Quenya. And so initially, in the beginnings of Sauron's life, he would be referred to as someone being admirable. And in his early life, he had a love of order, a love of perfection, and a love of craftsmanship. And the type of being that Sauron was is something called a Maya. Maya being the singular and Maiar being the plural. And if you're not sure what that means, I do think it's important to take a step back to make sure that we have a foundational understanding to build upon. The god of the Tolkien universe is Eru-Ilúvatar. And before he created the world which Middle-earth sits in, that world being Arda, he created these powerful spiritual angelic beings that are referred to as the Ainur. And the Ainur consisted of two different groups, the Valar, plural, or Vala being singular, or Maiar, plural, or Maya, singular. And the Valar were more powerful than the Maiar, and the Maiar served the Valar. And again, these were powerful spiritual angelic type beings. After the creation of the Ainur actually assisted within the creation of the world of Arda. And they assisted in designing the world of Arda through music. And the most powerful of the Valar was a being named Melkor. However, Melkor eventually started to get to the point where he wanted to independently create outside of Eru-Ilúvatar's influence. And as a result, during the time period where the world of Arda was being designed through the music of the Ainur, he began to sow discord within the music. However, Eru-Ilúvatar's will would not be frustrated in the overall creation of Arda, despite the discord that Melkor introduced within the music. Eventually, Melkor would become the first Dark Lord, and then he would later be known as Morgoth. And so, as Mairon, Sauron was known as the Admirable. And again, he had a love of order, of perfection, and of craftsmanship. And initially, he served the Valar Aule, who was the smith and craftsman of the Valar. And so when you think about who he would eventually become, the Dark Lord Sauron, for me, it makes sense that he one time served Aule, the smith and craftsman, and was able to learn many things under his tutelage. With those things that he learned, at least from my understanding, this potentially would have assisted him later when he turned into the Dark Lord Sauron and was able to use those craftsmanship skills in order to forge the rings of power, including the One Ring. Interesting enough, there was another Maya who was a servant of Aule, and that was Corumo. And it's interesting because Corumo would eventually become a servant of Sauron. Corumo would also be known as another name later in his life, that name being Saruman. And Saruman, of course, would one day become a servant of Sauron. And both Sauron and Saruman were once servants of the Valar Aule. Sauron as Mairon, and then Corumo, who would eventually become Saruman. And also when thinking about the Maiar in general, you are probably familiar with several others and you may not realize that they were actually Maiar, or these powerful spiritual angelic beings. And though they have less power than the Valar, they still are powerful and angelic beings. All of the wizards that were sent to Middle-earth were Maiar. So that means that Gandalf is a Maya, and his name was Aloran. And then Radagast, he too was also a Maya. The Balrogs, specifically the one that we see Gandalf fighting there in the mines of Moria, he's referred to as Durin's Bane. That Balrog was a Maya who had been twisted and corrupted by the dark powers of Morgoth. And so those are just a few examples, but perhaps you didn't know or realize that the type of being that Sauron is also the type of being that Gandalf is, or that Saruman is, or that Radagast is, or that the Balrogs are. And so Sauron did not start out evil. However, his love of order and perfection would lead to his downfall. This love of perfection and organization and order would eventually lead him to this tyrannical obsession with control. And in turn, this also too would lead to him becoming seduced by the powers of Melkor, that first Dark Lord, because in Melkor he would see a way that he would be able to accomplish the things that he desired at a faster and quicker rate. And when thinking about the powers and abilities of Sauron, because he was a Maya, he was in a sense immortal, meaning that he could not die of age or disease. He was also a shapeshifter. Initially, he could make himself very pleasant to the appearance of those around him, such as when he appeared as the deceiver Anatar, and making people believe that he was sent by the Valar to assist and to help the elves. And this is how he was able to manipulate the creation of the rings of power that were given to men and to dwarves. However, he could shapeshift into many other forms as well. This includes a wolf, a serpent, and a vampire-like bat. As we've discussed before, he was also a master craftsman, allowing him to be able to make those rings of power, including the one ring to rule them all. He was also able to be an enchanter, allowing him to place enchantments upon specific items, putting powers within physical objects, such as the rings of power. And he was also a sorcerer, and known as a master of wolves and werewolves. The werewolves that he had bred and raised, where he imprisoned evil spirits inside of them, resulting in them becoming these horrific creatures that he ruled over. And not only that, he was considered the most trusted lieutenant to Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. And he had a mind for strategy when it came to waging war on Middle-earth for his intents and purposes of domination and control. And again, this just speaking to the beginnings of Sauron and the type of being that he was able to have physical form, such as when he would shapeshift into different creatures, or as he shapeshifted into Anatar. However, Sauron eventually lost the ability to take upon himself a fair shape, meaning something that would be fair to look upon by those around him. And this occurred after he was captured by the king of Numenor, Ar-Pharazôn. And there, once he was captured, he was able to exercise even greater influence upon the men of Numenor. And after he was captured, eventually he became the most trusted advisor to the king Ar-Pharazôn. And there he influenced the Numenorians even to not worship Eru-Ilúvatar, but to worship Morgoth. He even encouraged things like human sacrifices for Melkor. And he encouraged the Numenorians to seek immortality by force, by going and sailing to Valinor, which is the land where the Valar lived, there within the world of Arda. And mortals were forbidden to sail to those lands. And as a result of the Numenorians' efforts to sail to Valinor and to attempt to take immortality by force from the Valar, Eru-Ilúvatar intervened and destroyed the island of Numenor. And when the island of Numenor was destroyed, so was the physical body of Sauron during that time. And after that, whenever he would again obtain a physical body, he would never be able to shapeshift into a fair form. And all of this occurred many years before the events in the Fellowship of the Ring. However, after the fall of Numenor, we don't know a specific time frame, but it would appear that not that long afterwards, that Sauron was able to regain a physical form relatively soon thereafter. And there's about 122 years between the time frame of the fall of Numenor, whenever Numenor was destroyed, and the War of the Last Alliance, when Isildur cuts the ring from Sauron's physical body at that time, destroying his physical body yet again. He would again have some sort of physical form during the time frame of the War of the Ring, that being the time frame of the story of the Lord of the Rings. And though I love the movies and seeing that lidless eye and how Peter Jackson was able to convey the power of Sauron and his menace and malice through that eye in Tolkien's writings was truly meant to be more symbolic, whereas he did have some sort of physical form during that time frame, and that eye wasn't really his physical form as far as the writings go. However, I do love that part of Peter Jackson's movies and his interpretation of Tolkien's writings. And there's actually so much more to cover when it comes to Sauron's life, but this was basically just to kind of go over his origins, what he was, his powers, and a little bit of an insight of his historical background. But in thinking about how I might be able to apply the things that I've learned about Sauron's beginnings and his life, and then who he came to be, number one, I think it's an interesting thought that he did not start out being evil. In fact, his name meant admirable. And then looking at what he was known for and admired for initially was his love of order and of organization and of perfection and of craft. However, he allowed that to become too much of an obsession, and it put him in a place where he wanted absolute control in order to maintain order. I think sometimes in life we can have truly good and admirable qualities to us. However, if we become too obsessive, it can take away our peace, and it might even lead us to take away the peace of others as we try to impose our own control over them. Not only that, it's been my experience that in times where I felt like I needed to try to control things more and more and more, I have found myself losing peace. It's kind of that idea of trying to grab and to hold on to something and being so scared to let go, because if you let go, whatever it is that you're holding on to might leave. And so, yeah, you might have the security of being able to have it clutched in your hands, but there's a constant anxiety and fear associated with what you're doing in order to maintain or hold on to that. And so it is much better to be able to open up your hands and to let whatever it is that you're holding on to go, and allow it to be something that if it stays, great. If not, it's okay, because you can't really have peace if you're just clutching on so tightly. I don't know if that makes sense, but at least that's the way that I view whenever we have even admirable qualities. If they become obsessions, and if they become too intense or too extreme, they can take us off a path away from peace, and they can also be detrimental to our interactions with those around us, especially those that we care about and that we love. I've honestly been guilty of that, and it's something that I want to change, and it's something I want to do better at. Also, if I understand correctly, one of the reasons why Sauron was seduced by Melkor, or Morgoth, is that he saw in Melkor a way for him to more quickly accomplish what he wanted as far as order and organization and perfection. Oftentimes, when it comes to things that are really important, it's best to put in the actual work and to be patient and to do things the right way. Sometimes we can be tempted to do things in a manner that we know really isn't right or just or fair in order for us to be able to more quickly get to the thing that we're trying to achieve. And from my experiences and from my observations, very rarely does that go the right way. And very rarely does that not come with lasting consequences. For me, it's almost as if Sauron saw a way to cheat in order for him to be able to get to someplace quicker. And ultimately in life, if we try to do that, more often than not, there will be consequences that could potentially be detrimental. And so for me, it's just not worth it. You also risk the chance that you could develop into someone that you don't really want to be. I wonder if Sauron from the very beginning of who he was, if he could see into the future and see who he would become, if he would really be happy with the individual that he would eventually become, when at one time he was known as admirable. If I understand correctly, Sauron actually means the abominable one or the foul one in Quenya. And so he went from the admirable one to the abominable one and the foul one. And that came as a result of his choices. And honestly, that can also come as a result of your choices or my choices. If we choose to do things the wrong way in order to get what we want in a faster way, it might change us into something more abominable and more foul instead of being admired. And then lastly, I think that it's important to take an honest evaluation of ourselves in our attempts and what we are trying to accomplish in our lives. It's my understanding that Sauron's intent in everything that he did all the way up until the War of the Ring and the events of the Fellowship of the Ring was to create a sense of order and to do away with chaos. However, that was at the price of taking away other people's freedoms and other people's ability to choose. And so in his mind, at least from my perspective, he's trying to do the right thing and what he thinks is best for everyone else. For me personally, sometimes I need to take a step back and realize that other people might want to do something that I don't agree with. And other people might want to take a path, even people that I care about, that I don't think that they should go down. But at the end of the day, they are in charge of their own lives, and I am in charge of my life. And I can be supportive and kind and loving and be there for them. But to try to control everyone into a sense of order that I think is correct, ultimately I think that that's going to take away my peace and also the peace of those around me. And it would be easy for me to justify it in my brain saying, well, ultimately I think it's what's best for everybody if we do these things. However, at what cost if we're just trying to coerce everyone to do things the way that we think that they should do them? Because Sauron ultimately felt justified and felt like he was doing the right thing for everyone by doing the things that he was doing and trying to eliminate whatever chaos he saw and tried to restore the world in a sense of order that he felt should exist. And so from my understanding, he legitimately thinks he's trying to help, when obviously, if you've watched the movies or read the books, he's not helping. And so that's a place that I don't want to be, and I don't think you would want to be in that place either. And so those are just some thoughts. Again, there's so much more to the life of Sauron, and I didn't really give a great overview as far as the step-by-step historical background of his life. But those are just a few things about Sauron's beginnings that I find interesting and things that I think that we might be able to learn and apply in our own lives. So it's this part, the beginnings of Sauron.